Welcome back to Frozen Bytes. My name is Rhian and joining me today is Lydia. In the last episode, we discussed climate change and some of the consequences. If you missed this episode and would like to learn more about climate change and some useful tips about how you can help, you can find it on our YouTube channel.
Today we're going to expand on the last episode and consider the effects of climate change on corals. One of the most devastating ecological impacts of climate change is on coral reef ecosystems. Climate change is thought to be the greatest global threat to corals. So why does climate change have such a huge influence on them?
Well, as temperatures rise, mass coral bleaching events and infectious disease outbreaks are becoming more frequent. Additionally, carbon dioxide has reduced calcification rates in reef building and reef-associated organisms by altering seawater chemistry and decreasing pH.
Climate change also results in sea level rise, changes in the frequency and intensity of tropical storms, and altered ocean circulation patterns, all of which dramatically alters ecosystem function, as well as the goods and services that coral reef ecosystems provide to people around the globe.
To discuss climate change and corals in greater depth, we have had the fantastic opportunity to interview two specialist conservation scientists, Pearce-Kelly from the Zoological Society of London and Zhixin Lin from the National Museum of Marine Biology and Aquarium in Taiwan. Pearce-Kelly is a trustee of the Frozen Ark. He is the senior curator of invertebrates, lower invertebrates and research at the Zoological Society of London. Pearce-Kelly coordinates the Zoological Department's research and conservation planning. Recently, Paul has helped to clarify the climate change and ocean acidification threats to biodiversity and their mitigation and adaptation requirements. Welcome to Frozen Bytes. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer our questions. Throughout your career with the Zoological Society of London, you've worked sort of predominantly with invertebrate species. So what would you say sort of inspired your interest in this sector of biology, do you think?
Well, invertebrates are such a diverse group. It covers everything, really, in terms of all the conservation issues and things, and just a remarkable group of animals. Anyway, and to keep the world going, let's not forget that. And you can do an awful lot with modest resources as well. And they tend to get overlooked a fair degree as well, which is crazy considering their importance in the world. So it's nice to be able to flag their importance up when everyone gets a chance, but also to do some targeted species work as well. So we're doing quite a lot of species recovery programs, both nationally and internationally as well. But in recent years, that's increasingly become more obvious that it's at the bigger level we need to be helping in terms of whole ecosystems, etc. And coral's a good example of that. If you want to save a coral, you've got to save the ecosystem that it's reliant on and that it builds and all of these things. So increasingly now trying to look at invertebrates in that bigger planetary context.
Yeah, definitely. It's probably one of the biggest sectors of biology that everyone just sort of thinks it's not important, they're not that bothered about, but it's probably one of the most fundamental at the same time. So speaking of corals and things, what do you think you'd categorise as their most sort of serious threat to coral reef ecosystems, and what do you think we can do to try and reduce that?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest threat they're facing is the lack of awareness of the problems they're facing, if you want my honest opinion. Mm-hmm. We know all the science is all there. People know generally that corals are vulnerable. When you say climate change and wildlife, corals are often the first thing you might think about. And we often think about that as thermal stress, temperature-related stress. And of course, that is probably the biggest one, because corals live at the edge anyway in terms of the environment they've actually evolved to be in. So they need everything more or less working at optimal to be able to be viable in that environment. It's a very challenging environment they're in. And of course, temperature is the big one in terms of if you go even just a couple of degrees above the normal, for any period of time, then they are very vulnerable to bleaching and losing their zooxanthellae and effectively starving or dying straight out from mortality. But there's a whole raft of other stresses as well in terms of climate change. There's ocean acidification, which is literally the chemistry of the ocean changing, becoming much harder for corals to build and maintain their skeletal growth effectively. And again, therefore, not being able to thrive in that environment. And deoxygenization, which hardly ever gets a mention as well. So they're incredibly vulnerable. Disease is spreading around the world, and that's being aided by the other stresses that climate change can bring into play. So there's loads of direct and indirect stresses, and you add them all up. Never mind things like ocean current changes and stuff. You add it all up, and it's an incredibly worrying situation. But that's all talking bland generalities, really. You can list a few more threats and things, but it comes down to, so what is necessary in terms of staying within viability thresholds of things like corals. And if you don't have a handle on that, then you're not going to help very much. And it's very clear to anyone who really wants to dig into this that if you don't keep the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere below 350 parts per million CO2, everything that you could do in terms of adaptability and building resilience and protected areas and stuff, it all has some effect, but it won't stop the ultimate slip into non-viable decline, the actual terminal decline for those ecosystems. That's the thing. But often we don't put these kind of threshold thoughts into place. We just tend to do what we can within this kind of wider thing. And that's why cryopreservation is so incredibly important, because I don't think we are going to affect the degree of environmental mitigation that we have to do to keep these things viable. So we better plan to cope losing a lot of biodiversity. And if it's not at least cryopreserved in biobanks, etc., we're going to lose an awful lot. And we think of coral as the 800 to 1,000 species of coral forming species, in terms of maintaining a reef. But those reef systems are actually reliant. There's about 800,000 plus species reliant on those reefs, mostly cryptofauna, a hell of a lot of fish and things, but lots of little shrimps and crabs and sea cucumbers and stuff. And coral might at last be getting some proper attention, but most of those critters are getting zero attention at all. So when you think about the biodiversity loss, it's an awful lot, isn't it? And that's why, again, we were talking about this the other night, we really need to extend our support with cryopreservation, etc., to all of those taxa while there's still time that they can be represented, and do all we can to try and keep them alive in situ for a healthy future. But you've got to have a good reality check as well, and we're not going in that direction at the moment.
Yeah, of course, obviously to keep it alive in situ would be fantastic, but it doesn't look like that's going
to happen. You have to do both. You really can't take the world doesn't have the choice to choose anymore. We have to do everything that is needed, and that is everything you can possibly bring to play to protect these species, and hopefully at the ecosystem level as well.
Could you sort of just talk through the cryopreservation projects you've sort of got going on at the moment?
Well, corals are interesting because they are probably one of the most interesting groups in terms of showing the value of cryopreservation, because people like Mary Hagedorn and the Hagedorn Lab out in Hawaii, linked to the Smithsonian, etc., they've been working, and colleagues all over the world actually, have really become great technically proficient people at being able to help coral, not just to preserve, but also to use that process to increase the resilience of populations, to help hybridization, help create more firm, more resilient strains, etc. And we're probably going to need all of that. So it's not just like putting things in a long-term deposit that you may still have representatives in the future. Coral are a really good example where you can use this cryopreservation to do an awful lot of other stuff as well. And not least because they only spawn for 2 nights a year. So if you're trying to breed coral, you don't have much chance. Pandas are a luxury, yeah? So coral is probably the hardest thing to do anything active with. So cryopreservation becomes quite a good way to do that, because you can freeze the sperm and all the rest of it. So you can be much more liberated in terms of reproductive assistance for those kind of things. Yeah, there's a raft of practical things. It's really not my key focus research area, but I've known enough from what colleagues are doing that we can take heart. We're lucky that the technologies or the skills are just about at a level now. There's no excuse not to be engaged and doing these things as much as you possibly can. It's just a case of is it getting the focus, and is it getting the acknowledgement that these aren't little peripheral researchy interesty things, that they're becoming increasingly probably the main hope we have of guiding biodiversity through what's going to be an extraordinarily stressful foreseeable mid to long-term future.
So in terms of sort of what we can do as a sort of planet to try and reduce some of these impacts and loss of biodiversity and things, I know that you're a participant of the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums Climate Change Task Force and the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Climate Change Specialist Group. So are there sort of some key changes that you think governments should be taking to try and protect the planet as a whole?
I think it just comes down to being increasing our awareness of the actual reality of the true threat we're facing. Yeah. It's not a linear process in terms of it just gets a bit worse and then a bit worse and then it gets a bit worse. We are really now at risk of, I'm sure everyone has heard about tipping points and cascading ramifications from those things, big system level impacts. So if we're trying to go for a target like the Paris Agreement at 1.5 or 2 degrees or whatever it is, it better be robust enough, because you're betting literally the future of the planet on it, or certainly humanity's well-being on the planet and everything that lives therein. And I think that's my biggest concern. Anyone listening to this, I would just urge, don't think it's all being sorted out somewhere and you haven't got to worry about it. You really need to engage, familiarize yourself with the science and the reality of the sensitivity of the systems, the planet we're living on, and see what's happening, not just in biodiversity, but in big Earth systems like the cryosphere, the polar regions, ice, etc. That's all going to come back to sea level rise and impacts on our own way of life, etc., and well-being. Don't think that's all adequately being sorted out, because it certainly isn't. Specialist groups are fantastic and they do an important job, but they're not doing the job, which is changing our direction of travel. So you can't be complacent that you can just leave it to anyone else.
Yeah, definitely.
I think the good news, I kind of, when I've seen how perilous everything is, it's also great that you can see some incredible solutions that could still be put into play to keep us from going over the edge, like restorative agriculture. There's a wonderful research group in Sheffield looking at silicate based fertilization of crops and things, which could sequester vast amounts of CO2. There's half a dozen things that could absolutely make a massive difference and effectively wipe out our problems. But I think most people listening to this would probably get a general sense that, well, yeah, but it would probably never happen at scale. Yeah. So what we've got to do is familiarize ourselves with the reality of things, and then try and encourage our political representatives, etc., to actually make sure that there is support and scale level rollout of the things we need to get out of this mess. Preserving biodiversity and not destroying massive carbon sequestering habitat is part of it, but some of these things like restorative agriculture and things, everybody benefits. The world's in a far better place and we can still get out of it. But if we don't do it within the time we've got left, it's going to become kind of irrelevant, because humanity will lose control of the system. That's the problem. When ice starts to really change, when we start to have carbon sinks becoming carbon sources, humanity's impact's going to become increasingly academic, because the system will take over and we will have lost that. So the most encouraging thing is we still have some level of control over that. Maybe the next decade, we could really turn it around and do the things, or we might be sitting here 10 years later saying, isn't it a shame we never got our act together, which is what we've been having to say for the last 30 years, really, isn't it? But now it's really probably is our last chance, I think.
Yeah.
But the positive thing is there are still things that really can be done if they're done at scale. But it ain't going to happen by a bunch of professionals faffing around between each other. Every member of society needs to become aware of these things and use our influence as citizens and use our pressure accordingly. And only then it will really happen. But you just got to familiarize yourself with the basic realities of what's actually happening, both the threats and the solutions. Wearing a jumper and cycling to schools, etc., is great, but it's not what we do so much as personal actions, although it all adds up. It's having an impact on the critical, higher level decision things, how our energy is produced, what we do in terms of sequestering, etc., etc. They are the mega things, and if they're not done, nothing that we do, or it almost makes us, just gives us a little sense of security that we're doing our bit, but it makes very, very little difference. Our real power is in our ability to affect influence on critical policy making. And we all have that power. We just choose not to use it by default.
Absolutely. It's like all these challenges sort of have the ability to spark sort of new innovation and stuff, but it's whether we actually act on it.
Yeah, we just got to be careful of thinking, oh yeah, we can just pull some science magic out of the bag at the 11th hour, because humanities, there's a lot of kind of pressure on what you might call the conservation community to always be positive. Don't be downbeat, because people don't like that. But again, you run the risk of just everyone just has a fuzzy feeling, but nothing really happens. And I think if we are in a perilous situation, you can't just pretend you're not, or say we have an existential extinction risk and then behave as if we don't have an existential extinction risk. This is what we all do, because the human condition, I think, is to generally default to kind of just life goes on, really, because there's always stuff happening all the time, isn't it? So it isn't that we're good or we're bad, it's just that there's always stuff going on, and we have and it's hard to keep focused on the really critical things because it's not immediately in our own working world, no matter who we are. But we know we can, as I said before, exert our influence in many ways.
And just as a final question, is there sort of anything in particular that you're hoping we could achieve as a planet in terms of becoming more sustainable in the sort of next couple of years?
Well, I think it's at the higher levels. We should have a sustainable action or target that will let us have a sustainable world. And I think the crisis at the moment really is the climate one, because no matter how brilliant we are at recycling or whatever it is, which are all important, all the traditional sustainable stuff depends how you define sustainability. But if we don't have policy which is going to give us a viable planet in terms of just keeping the major ecosystems and everything else going, no matter how brilliantly we are operating at all of the other stuff, it's going to have no impact because it's going to be lost. So we have to focus on that, and by focusing on that, by necessity, all the other stuff has to be done. Yeah. Because again, humans being what they are, we all know the basic things we should be doing, but it's easier not to do them than to do them, isn't it? So it's, if you really have, oh my goodness, we've got to address this issue, then all the other things which are needed to do it will be done. Otherwise, we won't have addressed the issue. But if it's not at an ambitious enough level, it isn't going to make, it's not going to have the impact that we all need. So be ambitious. If we're talking about save the planet, really focus at planet saving level. Don't worry too much about the smaller stuff. By having that done, everything will flow with it.
Yeah, because obviously it's always promoted all the time, and it is good to try and do your bit on a day-to-day basis, but really it is globally that this problem needs to be solved. So
it's still a good idea not to fly around the world 24/7 and have vast amounts of consumption and never-ending meat dinners and everything. So they're obviously we have to take our responsibility, but our biggest responsibility is to help influence how how our political representatives act. And if we can use that, then we can make a measurable difference.
Now we'll be speaking to Chiahsin Lin from the National Museum of Marine Biology and Aquarium in Taiwan. This is one of the partners of the Frozen Ark Consortium. Zhixin Lin is an associate researcher in the Planning and Research Department at the National Museum of Marine Biology and Aquarium in Taiwan. He's also a professor in the Institute of Marine Biology at National Donghuan University. Dr. Lin works on developing cryopreservation techniques for coral gametes, embryos, larvae, and symbiodiniaceae, and establishing a comprehensive specimen coral cryobank. Welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for joining us for an interview.
Could you please explain your background and how you got to the position you're in today?
I became interested in cryobiology while a researcher at the National Museum of Marine Biology and Aquarium in 2005. Given our minimal teaching load, exhibition, and science education, I have thankfully been able to dedicate a significant amount of time to work on cryopreservation of a number of marine organisms, including corals, algae, fish, and shrimp. Taiwan's Ministry of Science and Technology and the National Museum of Marine Biology and Aquarium have nearly continuously funded such projects since 2005, which has allowed me to maintain a high level of productivity, and more importantly, has led to some interesting findings. Our laboratory has several years of experience in studying both the basic biology as well as the cryobiology of many coral species. We have already designed a series of protocols to target subcellular, i.e. molecular, cellular, and whole oxide gamete level and its symbiodiniaceae parameters, and at gauging the response of early life history stages of these corals to the dramatic drops in temperature that occur during the low temperature preservation. Such protocols and associated data sets has helped us to understand, for instance, the changes in cell structure that occur during the low temperature preservation.
That sounds fascinating. It's amazing that you've had the opportunity to dedicate so much time to such an important field, and it's great to hear that the work of your team has contributed towards understanding fundamental aspects of cryopreservation.
Could you tell us a bit more about your frozen collection?
National Museum of Marine Biology and Aquarium has been involved with the Frozen Ark project since 2015. If the oceans become too marginalized for coral survival, their genetic material can be cryopreserved until a point in time in which coral propagation is once again viable in situ. National Museum of Marine Biology and Aquarium's CryoArk currently contains successfully cryopreserved genetic materials from 80 coral species. Such cryopreserved genetic materials, like coral cells, tissues, and larvae, are deposited in cryobanks for long-term storage. We also established what we call Symbol Cryobank in the National Museum of Marine Biology and Aquarium, Taiwan. 6 symbiodiniaceae species were cryopreserved in a total of 634 straws. We are actively collecting and cryopreserving coral materials and symbiodiniaceae to be used for research such as genetic modification and gene mapping projects, and as a backup source of genetic material for future reef restoration endeavors.
It sounds like the development of the Frozen collection has been really successful over the last few years, and that the materials can be used for some vitally important research purposes.
What specific projects are you currently working on, and what are you hoping to achieve in upcoming projects? Finally, what are your expectations for the future of cryopreservation and the use of your frozen collection to help coral reefs in situ?
Our lab has breakthrough in vitrification and narrow-laser warming technologies, which have enabled the successful cryopreservation of symbiote coral larvae for the first time a couple of years ago. We hypothesized that this approach could be used to cryopreserve the oxides and the larvae of many common Indo-Pacific reef corals, which also contain symbiotic dinoflagellates inherited from the parental colony. That's why we are currently developing suitable vitrification and narrow-laser warming protocols for oxide and larvae of common Indo-Pacific reef corals. The initial findings of this project constitute one mechanism by which coral biological material may be conserved over prolonged time periods, and this vitrification approach may prove successful with oxides and larvae from other reef-building corals, to where cryoarcs could be developed for storage of biological materials to be later used to reseed marine ecosystems. We are also promoting the idea of coral hospitals, which provide customized treatment to damaged coral reef or those that show signs of whitening before we release them to their natural habitats. The thematic groupings of coral hospitals, including coral diagnosis, coral treatment, coral rehabilitation, coral cryopreservation, and coral preservation and conservation. As one example of the topic I just mentioned, cryopreservation, so that a coral cryogen bank can be established. This will allow researchers to thaw out the coral and reseed reefs that may have become degraded due to, for instance, global climate change. The facility, along with the coral genome data set from the coral hospitals, can serve to conserve marine life and boost coral reef biodiversity.
It's incredible that you've been able to develop new technologies to advance this field, and it looks like your team has really important plans for future research.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We hope you've enjoyed the episode today. If you'd like to learn more about animal conservation, biodiversity and biobanking, please subscribe to listen to all of our future episodes.